You know that feeling, right? You're staring at a blank screen, and the reason isn't a lack of discipline. It's because your brain has detected a whole series of tiny micro-threats you aren't even aware of. This isn't some moral failure on your part, it's a mechanical one. Your brain has, for what it thinks is a very good reason, slammed on the brakes. So in this explainer, we're going to show you the three-step system for what we call mental friction points. It's like an engineering protocol to find and delete this hidden resistance before it ever gets a chance to stop you.
Just let that sink in for a second. The problem isn't some deep-seated character flaw. Nope. The problem is the design of the environment around the task. We've all felt that invisible force field, that weird paralysis when we're facing an important piece of work. Well, today, we're going to make that force field visible. We're taking this out of the world of self-help and putting it squarely in the world of industrial psychology. We're treating this not as a personal failing, but as a structural engineering challenge. And this, right here, is the fundamental reframe. The whole productivity narrative we've been sold is built on this willpower model. The idea that you just need to be tougher, more disciplined, you just need to push harder. But honestly, that's like trying to drive a car with the emergency brake on. You'll burn a ton of fuel, make a lot of noise, and you'll barely move. The smarter way? It's not to stomp harder on the gas, it's to just learn how to release the brake. We're shifting our focus from trying to increase our effort to systematically decreasing the resistance.
So here's our roadmap for today. First, we're going to define that invisible wall and the whole paradox of starting. Then we'll dive into the neuroscience to look at your brain's veto power. From there, it's all about the three-step protocol, the sensory friction audit, the 20-second downward slope, and the micro-start anchor. And finally, we'll put it all together so you can master the effortless start.
All right, section 1. Let's really break down this universal experience, the invisible wall. This is the paradox of starting. You've got that important report to write, that huge project to get off the ground. Your logical brain, it's totally on board. It knows the benefits. But then, when it's time to actually start, nothing. It feels like there's this tangible, unseen pressure just pushing right back at you.
So what's really going on here? Why do we waste so much energy in the meta work of just trying to start? Sometimes we burn more energy there than on the actual task itself. And here's the paradox. The more important the task is, the more we value it, the higher that resistance can feel. We find ourselves sharpening pencils that are already sharp, organizing our inbox. We'll do anything to avoid the friction of that first step. But this isn't random. It's a predictable systemic response.
You see, the old way frames this as a failure of discipline. It's an emotional problem that needs an emotional solution, right? Grit your teeth and just force it. But that is a draining and totally unreliable strategy. The systems thinking approach we're talking about reframes the whole issue. It says, stop fighting the current. Instead, become an architect of your own workflow. The goal isn't to muster up the force to smash through the wall. It's to systematically remove the bricks until the wall just isn't there anymore.
Okay, section 2, your brain's veto power. Now to solve this, we need an accurate diagnosis. The root cause of this failure to start isn't psychological in the way we usually think about it. It's biological. We have to understand the biophysics of procrastination to engineer a real solution.
The core concept here is something called activation energy. It's a term from chemistry, and it's basically the minimum energy needed to get a reaction started. For our brains, it's the cognitive price of admission you have to pay to go from a low-effort state, like scrolling on your phone, to a high-effort state, like deep strategic thinking. Every single task, no matter how small, has an activation energy cost. Now, what's so important is how your brain calculates this cost. Your brain is first and foremost an energy conservation machine. It has spent millions of years getting really good at avoiding unnecessary work. So it does this lightning-fast subconscious scan of your environment, and every little point of resistance, every micro-friction, gets added to the bill. A messy desk? That costs energy to clear. A vague to-do item like work on project? That takes a ton of energy just to define. Finding a file, opening software, a pop-up notification, each one is a little tax on your brain.
And this is where the system breaks down. When all those little micro-frictions pile up, the total cost of starting gets too high. And at that point, your amygdala, your brain's ancient, super powerful threat detection center, steps in. It doesn't see an opportunity for career growth. It sees the high activation energy as a direct threat to its #1 rule: conserve energy. And so, it issues a swift, non-negotiable veto. It shuts the whole thing down and immediately pushes you towards something with zero friction, like, you guessed it, your phone.
This shows that internal battle perfectly. Your modern, logical prefrontal cortex is saying, hey, let's do this complex thing for a future reward.
But your ancient amygdala, which evolved for survival, is screaming, warning, the immediate energy cost is too high and the outcome isn't guaranteed. Abort, abort! And in a battle of raw power, that visceral veto from the amygdala often wins out over our more thoughtful, logical brain.
Let's give this a proper name, an initiation freeze. It looks and feels like procrastination, but it's actually a physiological response to cognitive overload. So let me say this again, you are not lazy. The friction in the task has simply become too high for your brain's threat detection system to approve. And this is a game-changing diagnosis because it moves the problem from your identity to your environment. And your environment is something you can actually change.
Okay, section 3. This brings us to the really practical stuff, the 3-phase friction deletion protocol. It all starts with phase 1, the scan. We call this the sensory friction audit, because before you can remove friction, you have to develop the skill of actually seeing it.
So here's the full framework. Step 1, the sensory friction audit, is all about diagnosis. It's about putting on a new pair of glasses to see the dozens of tiny, invisible hurdles that your brain has to jump over just to get started. You're about to become a systems analyst for your own workflow.
So the crucial question I want you to ask is this: where are the microfrictions in your workflow? A microfriction is any tiny, seemingly meaningless point of resistance that adds to the total cognitive load. You have to audit every single step, from the very first thought of, I should probably work on X, all the way to the first physical action you take.
Here are some classic examples, but let's talk about the sneakiest one on the list, a vague task like work on project. This is a huge friction point because it creates what's called cognitive ambiguity. Your brain is forced to do all this high-energy, complex thinking just to figure out what the first step is. And to your ancient survival brain, ambiguity equals threat. The unknown might be dangerous. So a vague task isn't just inefficient. Your amygdala sees it as a direct risk, which dramatically increases the chance of it hitting that veto button.
The whole point of this audit is huge. By identifying and naming these friction points, you externalize the problem. It stops being an internal, emotional failure, I'm a procrastinator, and it becomes an external, structural design flaw. My workflow has too much activation energy. And a design flaw? That's just an impersonal problem that you can solve.
Section 4. Okay, once we've identified the friction points, we can start systematically getting rid of them. This is phase 2, the setup. Here, we're going to proactively re-engineer our work environment using a principle we call the 20-second downward slope. Right, we've finished our scan. Now we're moving to step 2. This is the environmental priming phase. It's all about strategically prepaying that activation energy tax so that when it's time to work, the path of least resistance leads you into the task, not away from it. And this phase is built on something called the 20-second rule, which comes from research by Sean Archer at Harvard. His work showed that our behavior is super sensitive to even tiny changes in convenience. If you can reduce the startup time for a good habit by as little as 20 seconds, you dramatically increase the chances of doing it. And on the flip side, adding 20 seconds of friction to a bad habit makes it way less likely. We can totally use this to our advantage.
This table shows you exactly how it works. Look at Write Report. Before, it's a bunch of high-friction steps. Find the file, open the software, remember where you left off. The low friction after, the document is already open on your screen with the cursor blinking. Going to the gym? Instead of a scavenger hunt for your gear, the bag is packed and waiting by the door. You're not just saving 20 seconds, you're killing off multiple decision points, and each one of those drains your mental energy.
This technique is called cognitive priming. Think of it like you're giving your brain a visual script to follow. You know, there's this great model, the fog behavior model, that says behavior equals motivation times ability times a prompt. Your motivation can go up and down, but you have huge control over ability, how easy the task is. The 20-second rule is a direct hack on that ability variable. By making the action radically easier, you make the behavior way more likely to happen.
I absolutely love this metaphor. You are literally greasing the neural wheels. You're engineering your workflow so that starting is easier than not starting. You're building a cognitive on-ramp, a downward slope, where the pull of momentum is stronger than the push of resistance. The amygdala scans this prepped environment, sees a super low activation cost, perceives no threat, and gives you the green light.
Section 5. Now, even with a perfectly primed environment, you still have to cross that gap between not doing and doing. You have to take that first step. That's why we need the final phase of the protocol, the ignition. This is where we use the micro-start anchor. Let's complete the system.
We've scanned for friction, we've engineered a downward slope to make it easy. Now for step 3, we have to create the prompt. This is all about defining that initial spark of action to be so small, so completely non-threatening, that it's impossible for your brain to say no.
So here's the key. You have to predefine your first step as a micro-start anchor. This is a physical action that is so absurdly small it almost feels silly. The design principle here is that it has to be too small to fail. It's not write chapter 1. It's something way smaller than that.
Let's look at some examples here. Instead of the goal being write the essay, the microstart is write today's date at the top of the document. That's it. Instead of study for the exam, it's open the textbook to page 74. The task isn't go for a run, it's just put on your running shoes. Your amygdala looks at the task put on shoes, calculates a near zero energy cost, and says, sure, we can do that. It's an easy, unambiguous win.
And this is where the psychology gets really cool. Once you do that tiny, non-threatening action, you trigger something called the Zeigarnik Effect. This is the principle that our brains have this innate desire for things to be complete. They get really irritated by unfinished tasks or open loops. So by just writing the date or putting on your shoes, you've opened a loop in your brain. Now your brain feels the subtle but constant tension to continue, to close that loop. You've just used your brain's own wiring to trick it into building momentum.
Okay, section 6. Let's pull this all together. When you combined these 3 phases, scan, setup, and ignite, you totally transform the experience of starting. You're no longer fighting a war of willpower against your own biology. You're creating a system where starting feels less like a struggle and more like a natural, logical next step.
What this whole system creates is a state of cognitive ease. When the path forward is clear, simple, and frictionless, your brain's stress response doesn't get activated. That internal battle just dissolves. Starting the task becomes the easiest, most obvious thing to do. And you stop wasting your limited supply of willpower on the fight to get started, and you get to invest all of it where it actually belongs, on the quality of the work itself.
So here it is, the key takeaway, the friction deletion protocol. First, you run a sensory audit to find the hidden resistance. Second, you engineer a 20-second downward slope to make starting easy. And third, you launch with a micro-start anchor that's too small for your brain to veto. Scan, setup, ignite. That's the system.
If you remember just one thing from all this, let it be this. Starting is a structural achievement, not a character trait. That feeling of frustration, that initiation freeze, it is not a reflection of your worth or your discipline. It's just a data point telling you that your workflow is poorly designed. So, stop trying to overpower your biology. Stop blaming yourself. Start making your environment smarter. Become the architect of your own focus.
Because in the end, true productivity isn't about doing more. It's about mastering systems that make focus effortless. It's about creating the conditions where your best work can happen naturally, by design. And that whole process begins the moment you decide to stop fighting friction and start to leading it.